see if it works. Streaming. All right. I'll try and figure out if I can figure out what was wrong with that later. All right, that's live. We live over here. We are, and we're going to hit transition. Hello, and welcome to some Derps Talk About Games. I'm your co-host, Mango.
And I am your co-host, Buddy.
Today we're going to talk about big boy stuff. But before we do that, Buddy, why don't you tell the folks at home what it is we do on this podcast?
On this podcast, we talk about games, but sometimes we just have to take a break to go deep into the Fast and Furious saga. This is maybe the furthest afield outside of like the April Fool's episode that we've ever got. Like, Fast and Furious has literally nothing to do with video games, right? Like, you can at least say that like video games and comic book movies have some like shared vibes of like nerd stuff, but this is like the opposite of that.
Yeah, I mean, I will. So Vin Diesel did go on stage once at the Game Awards to like promote the Fast and the Furious video game that looked like it was from 10 years ago. But yeah, basically this is
Man, I would love a good Fast and Furious video game. That would be like my jam. Anyway, so yeah, we're at Fast 5. We better fastly 5 our way to 9 soon enough because the new movie comes out this year. But yes, anyway, Fast 5, directed by Justin Lin, comes out in 2011, I want to say. Let's see, Fast 5.
Yeah, 2011.
Yeah, 2011. So a year before. I like to benchmark these around the superhero movies of the time because I actually think that that's like a really interesting thing. I have a greater theory about this that we can maybe like talk about a little bit later. But so it comes out in 2011, a year before Avengers, 2 years
3 years
before
after The
Man
Dark
of Steel.
Knight, which I think
3 years after The Dark Knight, yeah.
Which I think is specifically relevant, which maybe we'll bring up in the spoiler section.
Oh, you think it's specifically relevant?
There's one scene.
We'll talk about it. Talk about it, I guess. Yeah, sure.
Because we're avoiding spoilers for this 12-year-old
yeah,
movie.
because we are avoiding. I don't know that it's when I like just finished watching the movie when I got into the voice call to start the podcast with Mango, and I was like grinning ear to ear. I was laughing. It's so hard for me to contain. I love this movie. I love every second of watching this film. And you know, it is just when a lot of people talk about when the Fast and Furious movies got good, quote unquote, got good, right? Where they weren't just those dumb car movies. This is the one that most people point to. And most of the popular conception of what the Fast and Furious movies are starts here, right? Which I think makes it kind of this inflection point. If the first 4 movies were just kind of flailing around trying to figure out something kind of neat and interesting to do, Fast 5 is when they were like, oh, I got it. I fucking got it. We're doing it. So yeah, that I have a lot to say about Fast 5, but I'm sure we can get there. What's your top level?
Yeah, so you know, you said like this is when it stopped being just dumb car movies, and it's like what to replace it with like dumb everything else movies, because like this is not like a smart movie, right? Like, and it's fine. Like it is fun. I will agree with you. The other kind of like surprise intro I was going to go with was like Call of Duty Modern Warfare Favela Team Deathmatch, the movie, because that's like like literally that like happens in the middle of this movie. But I enjoyed this movie probably more than I definitely enjoyed it more than 4. I still think I like 3 better.
Whoa, that is insane to me. What a take.
Tokyo Drift?
Yeah.
I mean,
like Tokyo Drift is well regarded, but the Fast and Furious movies are not all that similar to something like we talked about this, like Star Wars. People have radically different Star Wars rankings for their favorite Star Wars movies, right? You know, for instance, Revenge of the Sith is my favorite Star Wars movie. And I think that's a defensible position. I think a lot of people have different sorts of defensible positions around, do you like Empire? Do you like you know, the original Star Wars A New Hope, you know, people who get on board for the sort of you know, Vader, Luke, Emperor stuff in episode 6, people who get on board for prequel stuff, people who get on board for sequel stuff, right? Like all this stuff, right? You can kind of make a bunch of different arguments about everything basically except for Rise of Skywalker, right? With the Fast and Furious movies, I don't know a single person who does not think that Fast 5 is their favorite. Just because like it brings everything into, it's like the satisfaction of like I don't even what's the it's of just of it all coming together, right? Of all of this shit that got set up in these first 4 movies set up. I should say set up.
I was
not
gonna say
intentionally set up. But like bringing all of that in, and then also kind of really introducing and kind of drilling down on this theme of family, and this kind of goofy sincerity that the movies sort of fly on, right? Like this is the stuff of Fast and Furious legend, I guess. So it's interesting that you'd say Tokyo Drift is better.
yeah. So I think part of it is like part of it might be that like I know that there's like another 6 movies, you know,
True.
moving forward, right? Like so like maybe that's just it, right? Like that, like, you know, I see what this has spawned and I can't imagine that this is the like the best of them, right? Like, because it's not like, so it is nuts, but it's not as nuts as the stuff as I've seen in like the trailers for like, I think it was Fast 9, where like The Rock is like pulling a submarine out of the ice or whatever.
Okay, yeah, that is Fast 8, Fate of the Furious.
Fate of the Furious.
Yeah, where the submarine is literally redirecting torpedoes on an ice sheet because they're being chased by a nuclear sub. So
Yeah.
you got me there.
So
right?
it doesn't have like that level of bombast, and at the same time, it doesn't have kind of like what I liked about Tokyo Drift was like there was some real racing stuff in there, right? And there was some like pretty good arcing stuff in here. This movie is just like all dumb action all the time, and that's fine. I enjoyed it. I definitely thought it was my second favorite of the 5 that we've seen so far. But like,
So never heard someone real racing. This is amazing. This is the greatest. Okay, yes, you are correct. The racing is basically just God. Whoa, so we should maybe enter spoilers, right?
Yeah, spoilers for this 12-year-old movie. Spoilers for all
this movie.
Spoilers for the 5 previous movies as well. Before
I can't believe this. Okay, so yes, famously in Fast 5, everybody always talks about this. There is a bit where they go, we're gonna need some tough cars if we're gonna pull off this heist. And then, you know, Dom goes, I know just where to go. And he goes to a street race. There's this setup with another guy where they're like racing for pink slips, which is like a Fast and Furious tradition. The guy is like, oh, Dominic, you'd think I would have known Dominic Toretto? Dominic Toretto's car would be like a great trophy in my trophy case. And then you hear like some revving engines, and then it smash cuts to them just driving back into the garage with that guy's car. Like they just the racing is so secondary that they've just off-screened it. It's not even worth it. Now, that is bandied about, but I will say there is a race in this movie, which is the character-driven race of it's Roman, Han, Dom, and Brian are all in police cars, and they do a quarter mile in the middle of the night on the streets of Rio. That is a race, but it's not an action scene race. So I do see what
No, yeah. No, and honestly, that I liked that race in particular just because like, oh, they're all in the same car. This is by definition a fair race, right? Yep. Like, you know, it's all about their driver's skill. It's not about like, you know, the fact that, you know, Dominic's been working on his car for 25 years, right? Mm-hmm. So I thought that was neat. This movie maybe also, since we're in the spoiler section, also maybe rubbed me the wrong way, because like this is literally the only movie that I can think of, the only series that I can think of that like pitches you a heist movie and then says, nope, we're gonna fucking ram a truck through the wall. That's the fucking movie now.
Yeah, I mean, I love a lot of the stuff that happens. I specifically really love the train stuff. The train stuff is famous. Do you know about the train scene? Have you heard this story about the train scene?
The first,
This was like 10 years ago. It would have been 10 years ago because when the movie came out. But this like made the rounds on like Twitter and stuff.
what?
Okay, so to tell this story, the part in the movie where they drive the truck into the train, that was an accident. They had $5 million to do this shot, and the shot was the truck was supposed to go over the off a ramp and over the train, but they accidentally drove the truck off the ramp and into the train. And then, which is cool. It's a real stunt, right? This is one of the big things about the movie. A lot of real stunt work is getting done here, compared to what I complained about a lot in
CG. Yeah.
The previous one, which was a lot of CGI, right? But they accidentally drove the truck into the train, so they rewrote the script and reshot a bunch of the action scene to instead be about the truck actually accidentally gets lodged into the train, and that's like the action sequence. This is part of like the mythos, right? And why people are like on board with the Fast and Furious like franchise, right? This focus on like practical stunt works, like a lot of stuff with the safe was sort of stunt. There's a lot of mix there, right? Because they're not driving around real cityscapes a lot of the time. There's like a lot of like background stuff that's all CGI'd in, but like the cars crashing into this massive safe, like a lot of that was real. A lot of that was filmed with real cars doing real practical effects, and there's this sort of like love story for that pops up in the wake of sort of Fast Five, but yeah, we are in the realm of we're just doing crazy action bullshit in these movies, and that's how it's happening.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. One of the things that actually stuck out to me that kind of bothered me during that scene is like, if they were if they were going to decide to steal the car. First of all, I don't quite understand. Doesn't quite grok to me why they decided to steal the cars instead of like just do the job that they were supposed to be doing. Like, maybe I missed that, but it didn't really make a lot of sense. Two, if you're going to do that, maybe don't have the first person that leaves the train give away the game, right? It's like have her drive along with the convoy until everybody's in a car out of the train, right? And like I don't care that much on like, you know, I'm not gonna like criticize the movie for this, right? Like this is not me being like ding cinema sin, right? This is just me being like why, right? Like, and again, I can forget it, I don't care, but it's like, what are we like it's obviously flimsy pretense to jump into this stuff, but it's like but at that point I kind of have to turn off my brain and just enjoy the action sequences, right? I can't really like interrogate it further, which is something that I thought with Tokyo Drift, at least I got a little bit more of there, right? Like things make a modicum of sense in that movie that they don't really make here.
Well, so what else doesn't make sense, right? Like the nature of the heist itself. I'm assuming.
So the heist itself, the nature of the heist itself makes sense. Like the moment they start pulling that fucking vault down the street, I'm like, that's not how physics work. Right? Like the physics decides to work at like the last minute when Dom jumps out of the car and the car gets like whipped around like by the other end of the flame, which is what it should have been happening this entire fucking time.
I know that.
Yep. Like fucking just like I'm also like as like this like final scene is happening is like are these guys supposed to be the good guys? Like they have wrecked large portions of downtown Rio and probably killed several innocent people.
Hey, they're criminals, okay? But they've got heart, all right? They care about family, all right?
There's a shot where like the cable like cuts off the top of a cop car, which is a cool thing, but it also implies that like Dominic decapitates a police officer with a car with like that cable.
Listen, he's a corrupt police officer, Mango. Don't think about it. Yeah, no, I do think that there is a certain level of that when it comes to the movie, right? You know, obviously I don't think the politics would make a lot of sense in any of this. When it comes to right, like
the Rock decides that he is going to get revenge and ram his like, you know, create an international incident by ramming his like presumably government made tough truck into the side of a Brazilian police headquarters to like help some ne'er-do-wells steal a vault and let the criminals go for 24 hours as like
Because I remember the first time I saw this, I was like, oh, this is how he joins the Fast and Furious crew. He watches his like squad get essentially just murdered by this like super corrupt guy, this drug kingpin who has all the cops in his pocket. He knows how corrupt everything is, and he decides to like join the criminal enterprise. No. He's still an officer of the law. The post-credit scene hinges on the fact that he's an officer of the law. The end of the movie has him, saying, I'm not the kind of guy to let them get away. And it's like, buddy, what kind of guy are you? Because you definitely just, participated in this heist because I guess, your connection to your squad, your boys was like strong enough. I like a lot of that stuff definitely sort of boggles the imagination. But at the same time, it's so fucking cool. Mango, come on.
Buddy, when they were on the bridge, why didn't they both just like hit the nos and like pull the vault faster?
because Dom had to make his heroic sacrifice in his one-man stand where he uses the safe to do all of the cool safe things. Okay, he hits the car with the safe, he hits one car with the safe into another car with the safe, he decapitates one car with the safe, and then he finally acknowledges the laws of physics, whips the safe into another car, and then uses his car to kill the bad guy, basically, right?
Not like, kill the bad guy, knock the bad guy out enough so that The Rock can execute him.
Oh, that actually is true and the greatest. You were right. And it is the greatest thing when he just pulls out, because he has that huge gun. I love this.
Yeah.
There's this moment earlier, this is part of what I love about Fast 5, right? Like The Rock is so good. He, in Patrick Williams' video, he talks about The Rock in this movie. He speaks entirely in one-liners, which is so true. Just like the way he says these things, where it'll be like the most mundane things. He's like, I want you to check trains, buses, planes, everything short of the space shuttle to make sure they didn't get into Rio or whatever. It's just like lines like that are so good, and he delivers them so amazingly. But there's this moment where they walk into the favela, and all of the guys, like all of the street toughs there with their AK-47 guns or whatever, they all start cocking their guns, and he just pulls out this huge fucking revolver, and they all immediately they're like, okay, you know what? You got us. We're not doing this. And the fact that he actually gets to shoot that gun by the end of the movie is just like, this is cinema. What a picture. I'm sorry. Yeah, at a certain point, this movie, I don't know that there is a better movie for rule of cool, right? It's just cool. It's just cool, man. That's
The Rock lets criminals that he thinks are muscly and cool go, and he executes other ones in the street, right? And the United States DEA is totally fine with this.
That's the part of the movie where he orders his guys to put back together the GT40. They do so. They're like, boss, there's nothing in here, and The Rock sits down, he presses one button, and the little computer pops up. They didn't ever check that computer. They didn't have to put that computer back together. They didn't even try and power it on or whatever. But like, you know what, man? Doesn't matter. The Rock, he's just that good. He sees it.
Why did Reyes need the computer? Was Dominic going to like mail that card to the feds that like are in, or I guess the Brazilian feds that are in Reyes' pocket anyway? Let them have the fucking chip, right? Like,
yeah.
Anyway, again, this is a brain empty movie, right? Totally fine with that. This is not a criticism of the movie. I guess it is a little bit, right? Like, I guess I needed this movie to transition into, me like leaving my head open for the next 4 of these, right? Like, and at that point I'll appreciate them, but like I was still at the point where I was like, oh, maybe there's a thing here. And the thing here is just like you said, weirdly sincere, right? Like I was convinced up until the moment he died that Vince was like going to betray them, right? Like, or that like, you know, I actually thought that like them getting captured by the police was going to be the traditional heist movie twist, right? Like that's how they get on the inside or whatever.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. No, I actually really like that. The them getting captured, they actually get captured by
Yeah.
Hobbs. And then it is the, you know, like the true bad guys who disrupt that whole process. That bit is, in terms of like character work, probably my favorite. So I like all of the family, I like all of the heart stuff, but I think the real thing that is sort of ticking like the beating heart at this is the idea that these are morally good people, right? They're not self-interested criminals. They are motivated by sort of higher order ethics, right? And this is the moment where Dom gets to really prove that, right? He is in a position, the same position that he was in when, you know, in his backstory when he like beat that guy half to death with the wrench, picks up the monkey wrench, but he can't do it. He's not going to do this to, you know, to Hobbs. They can have a good old-fashioned scuffle, you know, little boys will be boys scuffle, right? But he's not going to like resort to this level of, I almost want to say evil, right? And I think that like really grounds a lot of kind of a lot of what's going on and what's happening on screen.
So do you think they did like the what is it? It's like Arnold and like the Predator arm shake. They do the Predator arm shake, right? Like when Dom helps Hobbs up, like they do like the arm clasp, right? Like do you think that was like supposed to be referencing that? You know what I'm talking about? The Predator handshake?
Yeah, yes, I do know what you're talking about. Yeah, with him and Carl Weathers, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't think about that ever, but maybe.
Yeah, so it's not the same thing, right? It's not like the hand to hand grip, but it's like the forearm grip, right? Right, like
yeah,
that kind of like set like. I mean, that whole favela shootout scene is like it is surreal, right? Like in like I mean this, right? Like it is actually surreal, right? Like it looks like I wasn't kidding when I said Call of Duty. Hobbs' squad, like I'm kind of convinced that I need to go and look and see if they modeled the Call of Duty characters after these characters. That looks like a Call of Duty set of operators, right?
yeah.
And then the fucking like not like, you know, rocket launchers, like sure I'll buy, but like the guy that's like half out of the car dying and not one but two grenades get slow motion dropped from out of frame, like, and it holds on it for 5 seconds before it blows. It's like holy shit. I can't believe they fucking did this. It's so much fun, but it's so fucking stupid.
Right, or the thing where it's like where, you know, I think my favorite stupid moment in this movie is when they need to get his handprint and she just walks over and he touches her butt, and that's how they get the handprint off of off of Reyes. Yeah. And it's just like I guess maybe I'm just like poisoned by them. Like I'm like irony poisoned, because you expect that moment to go differently, right? You expect it to be like anything else, because it doesn't make any sense. How is Han supposed to get it in the first place? Like what is the idea there? It's not clear. And she goes with him on just like on a whim,
because there's chemistry between Han and Gal Gadot.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Like
because there's chemistry between Han and Giselle, which is great and it's true, and I love it. I want Han to get it in so bad, and I love the moment when he goes, "I think I'm in love." Like every like of these really subtle line deliveries is so good from Han or whatever. But like, what was his plan? What was he going to do to get it when he gave up and was like, well, I guess he has too much security and she gets out of it, right? Like, does the whole plan just sort of fall apart there because like he can't find any sort of access to, you know, access to this guy? And it's just like that stuff, I don't know, it just doesn't matter. I think part of it is also just the Seven Samurai of it all, right? Like the ensemble, and you have a bunch of different characters, and they're all fun and interesting in their own ways, and they do these like little unique things, and it's kind of anchored by like the main guys, right? Like obviously, like I said, the core of this series is Brian and Dom's friendship and how much they like really care about each other, and this is the first movie where that is just full steam ahead, right? There's no question, right? Um, Dom chooses Brian over Vince pretty effortlessly when it comes to, you know, suspecting that Vince is the one that kind of like fucked them over in the initial job. But like just Roman showing up and all of his lines, and he's goofy and funny and braggadocious, but everyone kind of gives him shit for it, and that's what makes him a fun character, right? Just like all of that stuff, I think is gangbusters. It's so good, right? And probably if there's any real thing outside of just it's so cool, it's obviously so cool. They're driving around a safe in this 2-car thing, and they're swinging the safe around Rio, bashing into cars all over the place. How cool an action scene is that, right? Outside of just that level of sort of like lizard brain reaction, I think that this is the stuff that makes it work, right? Is that the ensemble is well done, and there's a lot of little things that make it work, right? Like, so for instance, in that one race scene that we were describing earlier, Roman throws his police lights on. They're all racing in police cars, but Roman is the one who is going to do the flashy thing, right? Who's going to do this kind of like body thing, right? Or he's talking over the, like over the intercom and making a bet for $100 million or $100,000 or like whatever it is. And I just think that there's a lot of little moments like those that they just make it so good. They just make it so fun.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. So, just to kind of bring it back to the thing I hinted at in the pre-spoiler section, the reason I was looking at The Dark Knight is because they light the money on fire at the first house, right? Very clever. Like, I thought that was smart.
Yes.
But I was like, that's like the Joker scene. I wonder which one came first, right? And the Joker one came out 3 years before. Because that was like, that's like, oh, that's where that comes from, right? But it's like, I guess part of the thing that like bothered me a little bit about this film is that like it's set up to actually be like a really smart heist film, like an Ocean's 11, right? But it's not, right? Like I said, like it just like turns halfway through and turns into like and like it's not that anymore, right? Like it's not really a heist, right? It's like a smash and grab, which is fine, but like it feels like a lot of that heist setup was like kind of wasted.
Yeah, I mean, there is some stuff that I think like kind of comes into it or whatever.
Yeah.
And in a certain sense, one of the things I like about the movie is it undermines a little bit of. Okay, so I think part of the Ocean's movies, and I've described this before about kind of plot-driven movies, right? Which are these like ticking clock time bombs that you are sort of diffusing, right? And the question is, can you figure out what the plot is going to be, where it's going to go next, before the bomb explodes? Essentially, the bomb exploded being the plot reveals kind of what it is, right? And there's a bunch of these. The one that we liked was Bad Times at the El Royale is a really good example of one of these. But there's a million of them, right? And I like that where the Ocean's movies are pretty built on this. There's not really there's not really a character with an arc in the Ocean. Excuse me, in the Ocean's movies. It's just kind of you get a bunch of fun people in the room, and the fun ensemble sort of like does his thing. This is the exact opposite of that. This is all about sort of like heart and that sincerity that comes when Vin Diesel says family. And when people do the supercuts of the way Vin Diesel says family, a lot of those come from this movie, because from before here, he actually really doesn't. That's not as much of a thing, right? But after this moment is when it does become a big deal, right? And there are kind of quieter character moments, right, where like Brian is talking about his being nervous as a father. He's asking Dom what his dad is like, and Dom explains the concept of the family barbecue, right? If you don't go to church, you don't get barbecue, somebody has to say grace or whatever. And we've seen that barbecue. We saw the barbecue in the first one, but this is the thing that gives it the significance, right? That will eventually kind of trigger later down the line, and it becomes a thing, right? One of the things that I was talking about in our very first review was the number of different traditions that are like established in that movie that take on weight later. The weight comes here essentially because now these movies are about family. Because this movie specifically is about family. And I think that that's the stuff that kind of saves it from, maybe I would call this like the Rick and Morty heist problem, right? The Rick and Morty heist problem. Did you ever see that episode of Rick and Morty?
I don't think so.
Okay. Man, this would be a great example, but I don't know that. But to explain, you know how heist movies they have they have the heist playing out, but then like something goes wrong, but then you find out the thing going wrong is part of the heist the whole time or whatever.
Yeah, or that, or they have to. It depends on the specific movie, but yes, yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So okay, so Rick and Morty made fun of this. They did a whole episode about how heist movies are just about like you insert a flashback to explain why the thing happened, you know, because I wanted it to happen this specific way over like upbeat, you know, music or whatever. And there's a bit of that here, right? Like there is the legitimate plot twist of they switch out the vaults, right? Um but mostly the details of the heist don't matter. It
right.
is not all that important, and you're not really supposed to be keeping up with those things. It's mostly about setting up the action set pieces, right, and getting to the heart of this character drama, right? When Dom refuses to kill Luke Hobbs and everybody surrenders to the cops, that's game over, right? And then there's this huge shootout. Hobbs loses his whole team and Vince dies. And it's like, oh shit, this is now real. But now we can go back to, you know, like putting the heist on. And sure, like maybe I could make an argument that like they're improvising a lot of the aspects of the heist because that seems to be what is being set up or whatever. There are some aspects of the heist that were set up originally, right? Them stealing the police cars, for instance, that were set up originally that do pay off in this
Yeah,
final sort of like moment. But all that stuff, I think, all that stuff is incidental, right? It's the least important piece of the puzzle. The stuff that matters is that sincerity, the characters, the action.
yeah. No, I think I'd agree with that. Um, but like at the end of the day, I think that's like not like that's a fun movie. And it's a movie I'm happy, you know, I'm happy to have fun with. Great movie to put on as you know on the background, right? Like at a party or whatever. But I don't know if I could ever call it one of my favorite movies because also it beyond the coolness factor, it also lacks a lot of like kind of technical, kind of like gravamen maybe is the right way to put it, right? Like something I thought while watching this movie is like, you know, there's one scene which is kind of like weirdly funny. Is the scene where they're chasing, you know, Dom and Brian and Maria, is that Dom's sister's name?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Chasing them through the favela. And you know it's like this three-way fight, right? They're like the Reyes' men are chasing the three of them, and then Hobbs has just shown up and is in the process, and you know it is kind of like also interacting in the situation. And the police officer grabs Dom, right, and then the Reyes' man shows up and he saves her life, but what happens is like Hobbs' squad like four of them in like a fucking line step forward on the roof and just like gun the fuck down all of Reyes' men, right? But there's like so like they are holding the guns like at their waists loosely, and those things don't have any recoil on them, right? Like, and again, not that it's a real criticism, but like that's kind of why I like John Wick. It takes the gun mechanic seriously, and
Yeah.
I
True.
appreciate that, right? Like, and I think at some level, criticisms about that's not how guns work have like made its way into the popular cult. Like I've been thinking about this as like a larger scale, right? I feel like sometime we might have talked about this before, but sometime in like something between the 90s and the aughts is this line where like you don't have an excuse to make something that doesn't make any sense anymore, right? Because like basically Wikipedia has like made it inexpensive to do like basic research.
Oh
Right?
yeah, sure. So this is like the industrial, or I'm sorry, the information revolution, right? Where
Yeah.
before in the 1970s, when my dad is doing a research paper, he has to go to the library, check out books, read these books in order to do whatever. I can just Google everything, right?
Right.
If I ever have a question that I need to, it's like, oh, what was that actor in? I just Google it. I take out the little computer in my
Pocket. Yeah.
in my pocket that is connected to all of the information that humankind has ever cataloged on the internet and I just go, who is this guy in this movie, right? And that's something that, you know, years ago you never had the ability to do. Even something as simple as like maps and directions, right? You know, when I was going to when we were doing family trips, we were going to my cousin's house. My dad had me pull out the atlas to make sure that we were getting on the right routes and like taking the right freeways, because we needed to make sure that we didn't overshoot and then all of a sudden, oh God, we're going to Boston when we needed to get off and go to Cape Cod, that kind of a thing, right? So I definitely get like that level of because to a certain extent I want to give this a little bit of immunity, right? Which is to say that John Wick comes out whatever 2014, 2016 right. or whatever, you know, a couple years after this, and I think it's you know, there's a part of me that wants to say it's unfair to hold movies like this to that standard. But I think that that's ultimately a confirmation bias on my part, right? Like that is me. I like this movie and I want to sort of shield it from criticism. But I think the reality is you're right. And I do think that that's bad. And it does make it does make some of the stuff worse. But the interesting thing is I don't necessarily know that the gun physics mattering translates across the board. So for instance, I think the safe physics don't matter. And if they do, the movie is bad. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think I do. Yeah.
Yeah. Like if they can't do cool shit by these two cars are pulling the mace pulling the safe all around Rio.
Honestly,
right?
I was thinking it looks like it's like a flail. It's like a car flail.
Yeah, exactly, right? And like I said, that final run with Dom, you know that they sat down and they were like, okay, Dom is making this suicidal run and he's probably going to die, but he needs to figure out a way, you know, like to 1v9 all of these police cars. And they go, each beat is a new escalation of, okay, first he just hits a guy with a safe, then he does this, then he does that, and it goes up and up and up, and it kind of like builds. And all of that is built on the idea that it's fucking cool, right? That they're dragging around this gigantic safe and smacking into things, you know, smacking into things with it. So it's interesting to me that the gun, I think I would agree with you that the gun stuff.
So like, I don't want to, so this is I think a thing of where the culture has moved forward enough that like because that information is widely available, right? Like, you know, if this was 1980, right? They'd have to hire like a firearms expert, or in the general sense, right? Like hire an expert on whatever thing. Like, and that's money, and maybe they don't want to do it. And of course, also part of this is Hollywood has an established gun language that is unrealistic, right? Like even John Wick gets silencers wrong, right? Like that kind of thing.
What do you mean?
Oh, silencers are not that quiet, right? Like
oh, yes, I understand. Okay, yes.
Yeah, like, you know, there is a shootout in John Wick where like no one notices them because they're being very good with their silencers, right? That doesn't happen. A silencer means that it like won't burst your eardrums. That's about it, right? Like you will still hear it. But like the point being is like this was like acceptable in like this is becoming less acceptable, especially post John Wick. You have the unrealistic gun physics, not because like if I had watched this in 2011, I probably wouldn't have this criticism, because not only would like, you know, the only people who cared about that were people who cared a lot about guns, whereas like now everybody kind of knows that kind of thing because like there's enough of a cultural imprint, right? And so like I don't know. I didn't really mean it as a criticism so much as like I appreciate how far we've come since it, because now we get like, because since realistic gunplay has been a thing that like has permeated the culture through things like Call of Duty, through things like John Wick, right? Like we want it to, like, more people know more things about it now. And so like, you know, just kind of as like a point in time type thing, right? Like,
yeah, that's interesting. I do think I would say that there is a sort of problem in that first chase scene, and maybe less about the second one, because I don't think that's as much an action scene, really. Like that's just like a shit hits the fan. They're just getting, you know, the like that I don't actually think the point of the scene where they're in police custody, they're like Hobbs has them, and then they get attacked by Reyes's guys, right? Like that's not as much of an action scene as much as it is just like a tragic scene in a way, and the one that establishes the ways that Hobbs's relationship with the Fast and Furious crew is going to change. But that first scene I do think lacks something, and it probably is because of the unrealistic gunplay. Is really kind of the argument that I think I'm probably making here. And there's probably something that's neat and interesting to the way in which realistic gun physics, realistic gunplay matters to this level of the story. But realistic car physics don't. Do you know what I mean? So for instance, the safe stuff is like unrealistic car physics, right? There's plenty of other stuff that we would consider to be unrealistic car physics as well, I'm sure, right? Like if we were actually talking about some of the other like pieces of sort of like the car puzzle. But that doesn't matter, right? Because in the moment, the action is built on this cool thing happening, and we all sort of agree that it is sweet and it is cool.
The gunplay
and
is
I think
not
that contrast is interesting.
Yeah, the gunplay is not fantastical, right? Like this is kind of like, you know, why, well, you believe in space wizards, why don't you believe in the rest of, why don't you believe in these other flaws in Star Wars, is a bad criticism, because like, the interior rules of the universe, it's a little bit different in this situation because like cars are real. As weird as it is to say, but like the interior, like if I'm going to make the strongest case for it, right, like the magical stuff in the Fast and the Furious is the car stuff, right? Like cars are magical in Fast and Furious. Nothing else really is, and like there's no point for it to be magical, right? Like, it's not like Hobbs's team lazily gunning down the gangsters is like a necessary part of the craziness, right? They could shoulder their guns and have it not be an issue, right? Like, like them missing all of their shots, even though like, there's plenty of opportunity to shoot them. That's not a problem. Them like lazily executing the gun aspect is a little bit of a problem, right? Is that about right?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I actually do think I agree with you. So for instance, like there's a fantastical element to the plot armor with which, there's a moment where Dom is running across rooftops on the favela and there's a guy in a thing and he's shooting, but you're watching all of his bullets miss, right?
Yeah.
That's theoretically pretty fantastical, right? Like we could, we could accept a realistic world where it's not that hard to shoot, Dom at 20 yards with an automatic weapon, right? But yeah, the actual sort of like stance in which it's funny because I even think that this matters in like smaller ways, right? Like the ways in which I watch people hold, because like one of the things is that people don't hold pistols the same way anymore. They do the sightline thing with pistols. That's a John Wick thing, right? And it's real, but it has completely changed the legibility of the ways in which people are dealing with pistols in these action scenes, right? Like you will see it in completely unrelated, like this isn't just a John Wick thing.
Right.
Like lots of action movies that are coming out in the modern era are built on those sorts of attention to those sorts of details, which I think is kind of neat and interesting. Yeah, it is funny that there is the moment where they stop the cars and the safe, in order to do the thing where they split apart and the safe crashes into the trucks or whatever, and then they're pushing the safe through like the alley or whatever. All of that is really built on sort of magic, as well as like their magical, they essentially have the superpower of driving cars good. I gotta tell you, like that's like it's like in like superhero comics there's this thing of like peak human like fitness, which is like a really common thing for normal characters to have peak human fitness. So for instance, Batman, one of his superpowers is peak human fitness, right? Green Arrow, peak human fitness. All of these characters kind of have that, like as a given. All of the characters of the Fast and Furious are peak human driving. And that gets a little canonized when Luke Hobbs shows up and he says, whatever you do, don't let him in a car.
Yeah.
Okay. When it comes to like the full crew, do you have a favorite? Have you coalesced on a favorite? Like my favorite is Han.
Not Baby Ludacris. Like he is the only one besides Han who, like, the people who left a real impression on me are Ludacris and Han, baby, right? Um, and I don't, and Han's for like metatextual reasons, right? Like Han left an impression on me because, like, in end of the movie, he's like Tokyo can wait, which is like a very like metatextual thing, right? Like, um, but like like Ludacris is like is humble, right? Like Roman is like, man, I'm gonna be fancy and like gregarious, and Ludacris is like, I want to open up my own little shop. I'm still gonna one up you at the end of the movie, but like, and he's also like, he's like, I had a life before this, right? And like he like can bust open the safe, right? Like,
Oh
that,
yeah, I love that moment. There's a couple of that's why I think it's repeated. I think Han says it also,
yeah,
where he
yeah,
says, like, I had a life before this. Yeah, I agree with you. I definitely love Tej. It's funny because there are certain people who stick around in the crew, and certain people who kind of fall by the wayside. Tej, Han, Roman, and Giselle are like permanent fixtures of the Fast and Furious crew. But Santos and the other guy, obviously Vince dies, so Vince is not in the crew anymore. Though I really love Vince in this movie. I will say one of my favorite things about the movie is there's a shot where Brian is looking at the forearm that's all scarred up because in the first movie Vince got like tied to a cable on one of the trucks, right? um and Brian saved Vince's life from that, like from that situation, but it was also the moment where he gets like outed as a cop or whatever, and it's just like it's a little insert like that like it feels good, to sort of see all that kind of complex history play out between sort of the two of them silently in just like a moment.
yeah. No, I mean, it's Vince is like an inverse, or he's like a red herring, but like in
Mm.
like a weirdly sincere. He's like, no, he's actually not the douchebag you think he is. He's actually like a good guy, right? And he's just trying to do right by everyone.
Yeah, and he's still part of the family, and he gets
Yeah,
his cut for Nico, whose name is Dominico, I guess.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, yeah.
Yeah.
Nico as a nickname for Dominic makes sense to me, right? Like,
Yeah. It's funny. I have a cousin whose name is Nicholas, but we call him Nico, and which is an Italian thing. In Italy, the nickname for Nicholas isn't Nick. It's Nico, I guess, just as a thing. But it's just like a funny little detail that I noticed this time around. But I feel like I missed it in like other previous viewings of the movie.
yeah. No, I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. I don't know. It was definitely a heartstring puller, right? And that's like kind of when you know that he's sincere, right? Like he doesn't name his kid Nico if he's not going to actually like do good by everybody, which is good, right?
Yeah.
Like you said, it's a very sincere movie. In this era is like also kind of like peak cynicism, right? Like peak anti-hero, right? We were talking about the Dark Knight, right?
Hmm.
Like um the start of like the Bathos Fest that is the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? You said you wanted to make a comparison here. Did
Oh
you
yeah. Okay. So yeah, we can end on this. Here's my big thing. One of the things that I thought was really interesting was looking at the J. An observation that doesn't come from me. It comes from our friend Film Robert. Movie Bob made this comparison where basically James Bond is chasing the trends, right? The thing, if you look at the James Bond movies that come out, there's typically a really big action movie thing happening in those movies that it is kind of coasting off of, right? So, for instance, Casino Royale comes out 2 years after, I think 2007, 2 years after Batman Begins, right? That's Skyfall. God, is it Skyfall? One of them.
Quantum of
God,
Solace?
I'm sorry. I think it is Skyfall actually. Oh yes, Skyfall. Skyfall comes out 4 years after The Dark Knight, but it uses that same plot twist where the villain plans on getting captured in order to be brought into like in order to be brought into the main hero's base and do his whole right, like, oh,
Evil
my
plan.
plan was actually
Yeah.
to, break out this whole time, kind of thing. Spectre, which is the movie that introduces Ernst Blofeld as the architect of all of your misfortunes, James, right? Is kind of aping Marvel cinema stuff, right? Like Marvel Cinematic Universe stuff, kind of going back and pretending that all of these previous movies are actually connected. They are actually all one, cohesive universe, when realistically they were just kind of episodic stories that didn't have a ton of connection to one another. That kind of a thing. And so he made this he made this observation. And the thing that I realized is that I feel like the Fast and Furious movies are actually kind of the opposite of that. The Fast and Furious movies are predating some of these things, right? We have Fast 5, which is functionally a lot like the Avengers in the sense of, there's a bunch of characters from previous movies who all join together in order to like make the ensemble team to deal with the thing. That predates the Avengers by like a year. And there's some other stuff, that I could probably talk about, but I don't want to get into like spoiler territory for sort of later down the line movies. But I really like but I actually think that kind of tracks and makes a certain amount of sense, especially because the Fast and the Furious movies they have always been popular, but like they haven't been popular in as wide an audience as until this movie really kind of like shot it into the stratosphere, right? And I think the shared universe and sort of the lore behind Fast and Furious that will eventually get more and more kind of important is actually indicative of a hunger for this sort of serialized storytelling across genres, right? I think we're seeing that a little bit with Star Wars now as well, to be fair. But at the time, it kind of felt like a superhero thing, right? Like really densely, heavily continuity focused things, right? It was kind of a superhero thing. But it's actually bigger than that. And Fast and Furious shows that it not only is it bigger than that, it's been bigger than that for a long time. The fact that there are lines, there are shots like Brian looking at Vince's car, right? Or lines like Han saying, we'll get there eventually about going to Tokyo, right? Like these are the kinds of things that rely on having an audience who is familiar with the surrounding lore of this universe and who has kind of bought in on some sort of level to that stuff. And we're now in a culture that is saturated with it, right? In fact, you and I have both expressed frustrations on a certain level, right? Like we haven't watched all of these Marvel TV shows and kept up with all of the details because like, watching 12 hours of television just to find out what one minor character is going to show up in a movie in 3 years or whatever is like, kind of doesn't feel worth it. But I also feel like I have to do my homework. Otherwise I'm going to get spoiled on Twitter for some, like bullshit thing, right? Like all of that kind of stuff. I feel like, it's interesting seeing it in as a wave overtaking the culture that is charted out in these dumb Fast and Furious movies. Oh, I'm sorry. And the other piece of this is that these movies aren't based on anything, right? This is part of the magic of them and part of one of the things I like about them. There is no source material. There are no, I'm not going to go read a Wikipedia article on who Kang is before I go see the movie because I know Kang is based off of a popular Avengers villain who has all of these iterations and does all of these different sort of things. No. These movies come out and they chart a completely new path. And so it's interesting that in a world of sequels and reboots and remakes and all this other sort of stuff, here is an original franchise, but it's still operating on the same rules of continuity and lore that the sequel, reboot, remake kind of craze is caught up in. That's my like big overarching point, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, no, I mean, I get that. I don't know if I buy so much. Like, you like, yes, this movie predates the Avengers, but like the seeds of what the Avengers was planting, had been there for a while. Right, like Nick Fury was at the end of Iron Man, right? Like, and so I don't know if I want to like because I don't know. You obviously know more about the production than I do, but it felt to me, at least at the time, that like around the time that like this movie was coming out, it was like, really, they're making more of those? Because like the first three felt very spaced out to me, right? The first one was like 99, right? Like,
Yeah, to be clear, I'm not assigning an intention here,
Okay.
right? Like I'm not saying that Fast Five beat Avengers to the punch, right? They did it first, kind of thing. It is that it is noting the groundswell in the culture popping up in an unexpected place, sort of showing a mirror effect to what we would have maybe thought was kind of localized to the Marvel Cinematic Universe,
Okay,
but was
yeah.
actually happening in this other place at the exact same time and happening in a way that we wouldn't necessarily expect because this is an original franchise. It is not the kind of, nerd focused, right? Like
Right. Because
pulling on some.
the original version of this is in like the Marvel is like a Marvel movie comes out and like the people who are big comic book nerds know certain things because like actually this was the plot line, right? Like
Yeah, and this is something that is gratifying, right? Like this is part of why I think the Marvel Cinematic Universe is so effective is because it invites this sort of meta text to be created around it. It's kind of like how a game like World of Warcraft invites a meta text, right? Which is that you don't just experience the game, you're also experiencing all these other things that are connected to the game. You're going on Wowhead, you're reading guides from famous writers. You're watching, streams from famous players who are the best at this class and are the ones who can tell you, no, you should take this talent and not that talent. All of this is like meta text, but the game itself is fertile ground for that meta text to sort of exist,
right.
right? Marvel movies are the exact same thing. Marvel movies are like part of what is intrinsically interesting about them is that you can have this thing of, oh, the trailer is coming out for the next Marvel movie and let's go over all of the little comic book Easter eggs, right? And that's a 15-minute YouTube video that a million different video essayists are going to put together, right? Or you hear casting details or the fact that, for instance, when we learned in Guardians 2 that Kurt Russell got cast, there was a question of who he was going to play, and you could do this thing where it's like, oh, could Kurt Russell be X? Could he be Y? Could he be Z? And then it turns out he's Ego, the living planet. Like all of this kind of stuff, right? Like that is very fertile metatext, and the only reason that it exists is because there's this interaction between the adaptation of the movie and the original source material. Fast and Furious doesn't have any of that sort of stuff, right? But it does have that attention to lore and the serialized nature of the movies, and I think that that's kind of the heart of a lot of this stuff. Anyway, I just thought that's interesting. There's not more to it than that.
Yeah, no, I definitely I get it, and that is absolutely interesting. That's also probably a good place to leave it because like, you know, as much as this movie is fun, it is kind of like head empty. So like, we've talked a fair amount around the movie, which I think is appropriate.
Yep.
Um, but with that, I'm gonna say, buddy, how was your week?
Oh man, how was my week? What did I do this week? We did a lot of mythics. Mythics are rough this week. There's an interesting ongoing conversation happening around Mythic Plus in World of Warcraft. That I am slowly getting frustrated with, but also interested in. Like I'm interested in it in the sense of like the podcast, but I'm frustrated with it because it seems to be basically the next version of Borrowed Power. I kind of want to do a full episode on it, but I don't know that we could really support that. And but it's definitely like very, sort of like it's got my noodle wiggling around in there. I'm thinking about, some of these things. What else did I play? I played some Pathfinder Kingmaker. I got back into that because I want to get back into playing it and beating that game. I played a lot of Zoetti. I played a lot of a Hearthstone. I guess a medium amount of Hearthstone. Um but yeah, I don't know. I have some stuff to talk about, but what do you have? Do you have anything you want to go on
Um,
first?
so just what? Uh, so I'm making my way through God of War Ragnarok. I'm close to the end of it. I spent like most of my weekend doing that, so not a lot to go into there. It's a fun game. Highly recommend it. It's I'm at this point where like essentially because I sensed I was getting near the end of the story, I did like the whole cleanup thing. I don't know if you do this, but in games it's like, oh, you're gonna hit the end stage point. I'm gonna go clean up all the side quests that I didn't do. Um, and like the Berserker King, much like in the first game where the Valkyrie fights were the big hard challenge, the Berserker King fights are like the Berserker Gravestones are like the hardest challenges. And it's weird because after doing those for a while, everything else just seems super fucking easy. Um, but the only other big notable thing that I did this week is this video came out. I watched 1 minute of this 3 minute video about 2 dozen times because they announced we knew Zangief was going to be in Street Fighter 6, but they finally released his trailer, and I am so fucking hype. This came out alongside a trailer or the same trailer was also for Cammy and Lily. Lily is a new character who appears to be the daughter of T-Hawk and definitely shares his moveset, but has, like, obviously is visually different. But I'm just hyped for Street Fighter, right? It comes out in June. Like, I think Zangief looks great, and that's been my big kind of hype moment for the week. It's like Zangief, but that's basically it. What do you want to talk about more? Like, I also talk about more stuff, but
have you been watching anything recently?
Have I been? No, not in particular. Just YouTube videos.
Man, I was watching something. What fucking was it? Yeah, I have also been watching a lot of YouTube videos. I'm very addicted to well, actually I'm less addicted now because I think the context of sort of the things have changed. But yeah, I have been addicted to YouTube videos recently, and I've been putting a ton of hours into them.
Yeah, I spend probably too much time watching YouTube videos, but that's it's okay. Yeah. You said you had some stuff to talk about with Hearthstone or something like that.
I don't know. So the WoW stuff is maybe what I'm interested in talking about. I don't know that we can support a whole episode.
Well, let's talk about. We got a bunch of time, and neither of us have.
Exactly. We have a ton of time on the clock. So here's the interesting thing. I wrote in the WoW Circle Jerk Unjerk thread, which is typically the place that people go, or the way that, at least on my end, I tend to go when I don't want to engage with like the main WoW subreddit about the stuff that it is currently complaining about. Like, I don't want to get in a fight about whatever they're kind of complaining about. I'm just going to go to the Unjerk thread, and I'm going to make my complaint. And the thing that I wrote was that the term mechanical bloat is going to be the new borrowed power for this expansion, because it seems like the thing that's happening, Dragonflight's been out, it's been out for a while, and the thing that's been happening is there's a growing sort of upswell of frustration in the Mythic Plus community, and the frustration is typically centered around this idea of mechanics bloat, right? Which is that every mob in every dungeon has something you need to pay attention to, and if you don't, it kills you or you wipe, right? If you don't interrupt this cast, you die. If you don't do whatever this thing, someone is going to get one shot. And the idea is that that the Dragonflight dungeons are a unique and new version of this level of mechanics bloat to kind of the game. Now, obviously, because I'm framing it this way, I'm going to disagree, and I do disagree. And here's why. In Shadowlands, gear for Mythic Plus stopped at a plus 15, right? When you cleared plus 15s, you got Mythic level gear. You got the highest possible level gear, right? And when you finished a dungeon, you got like rating or whatever, and you could get like an item, and you could upgrade that item to about the top end of heroic in terms of like the what sort of the floor is. And the rating required to do that was getting sort of 15s in time. So everything above a 15 was purely sort of ornamental and cosmetic, right? It wasn't real. It was just kind of points. Yeah. It's like, I wanna brag about this, and then you get to 20s. You had Keystone Hero, and maybe there's some stuff in season 3, for instance, conduits were tied to Keystone Hero. But at the end of the day, the power, like the power of your gear sort of stopped at a 15, which sort of meant that most people were running around that 10 to 15 level, and when they hit their 15s, they kind of got good enough, right? And they sort of like moved on with their week, right? So you get a lot of raiders who would do like a couple of 15s for the vault because it gives higher eye level gear than what they were getting in heroic raid. But typically 15s are about as good as heroic raid in terms of, you know, gear, and what they're getting out. The change that happened in Dragonflight is that the gear has now expanded all the way up to plus 20, right? So putting a 20 in the vault is what gets you the highest level of gear, not a 15 anymore. And Valor also expanded by 1 level so that you could get into mythic level items, right? So for instance, in Razageth, Razageth Heroic is going to drop item level 411 gear, but with Valor, I can pump a piece of gear to item level 415, right? Which is basically the bottom level of what a mythic boss would give you. 421, which is the high, like the very highest end level, 421 would be coming out of mid-level mythic boss raids. And then there's some stuff, anything that drops off mythic Razageth or mythic Broodkeeper would be item level 424. You can't get anything close to that in mythic plus, right? I hope those numbers are comprehensible because, you know, it's all sort of like
Bigger
complicated.
number is better. It's for
Yeah,
people
right.
at home that don't follow, right? Like,
Sure. So now you have this incentive for people who in Shadowlands were playing the game. Okay, I'm going to do a couple of plus 15s. I'm going to do a I'm sorry, one more other change. One, rating inflates at a higher rate at higher levels, right? Going from a completed 17 to a completed 18 is more impactful than going from a completed 11 to a completed 12, right? At the bottom end of the list, the ratings are packed pretty tightly together, and then they get sort of zoomed out over time, as you get higher into the kind of high end, which has some implications for some of this like gear sort of stuff. And the other thing that they did is that the scaling numbers increased at 11. So basically, what used to be, let's say, an increment of 5 between doing an 11 keystone and doing a 12 keystone is now an increment of 7, right? And the difference between an 11 and a 13 is now a 14 instead of a 10. Does that make sense? Where you're kind of jumping even higher and higher, right? So the scaling got tougher, the gear got better, right? And you have this whole class of players who look a lot like us, who are heroic raiders. They're probably not raiding mythic, right? But they want to get ahead of the curve. And one of the things they do to support that is they put time into mythic dungeons. In Shadowlands, these people have 2 years where the dungeons they are putting into are 15s in order to get the highest level reward. Now, in order to get that level of reward, they need to push 20s. But the reality of pushing 20s is vastly different. And not only that, 20s now are harder than 20s were in Shadowlands, right? Because of this scaling issue, this 5/7 sort of scaling issue. So when you're doing a 20 now, it's kind of like you were doing like a 22 in Shadowlands, right? And what this has created is a world in which people have expectations that there are certain caster mobs in a dungeon, right? So, for instance, in the Ruby life pools, there are these mobs called Cinder Weavers who will chain cast a Cinderbolt, right? And the Cinderbolt does a bunch of damage, and sometimes there are 2 Cinderbolt, like, you know, casters in a group, in a pack, and if they both target the same person, they'll one-shot that person because the cast do so much damage at that keystone level. But what they're used to are caster mobs from something like Halls of Atonement, which cast sort of freely in the exact same way, but the damage is much lower, because they're in a 15, they're not in a 20, you know, what would effectively be a 22. Right? Yeah, exactly. And so the level of coordination needed in order to get the level of gear has gone way up. And what I think this has happened with, and so is kind of my thesis. Mechanic Explode hasn't happened. It's just people are the incentives to run higher end content have increased, and now people are running into that content and a ton of friction around it, right? And one of the interesting things about that is that when they're complaining about Mechanic Explode, they are also complaining about dungeons that are from 7 years ago. So Halls of Valor is a dungeon in which every mob is doing something that is really dangerous and lethal, and you need to be tracking it and worried about it. And the tank is going to have to figure out when they're using their defensives, and you're going to have to assign people to certain interrupts, right? Like, so for instance, before any pull with a caster, I will say, I'm on the Thundercaller, Dave is on the Mystic, or I'm on the Thundercaller, Druid Bull is on the Rune Carver, that kind of a thing, right? That level of coordination is for a dungeon from 2016. This is a dungeon that came out with the launch of Legion, right? And it's the same sort of coordination that we have in Ruby Life Pools about stopping these Cinder Weavers from spamming sort of Cinderbolt. But the fact that we are now pushing these higher levels, and there's this incentive to go higher and farther and to really sort of like reach a level of play that is not something that somebody who's been playing Mythic Plus has really seen all that much of, I think has kind of been interesting. I don't want to completely discount these feelings entirely. I do think that there are probably some differences and pain like when it comes to some of this stuff, but it just has the interesting sort of like knock-on effects as people are sort of describing the fact that Mythic Plus feels worse right now than it did in previous sort of seasons. I don't know if any of that was legible. I really hope it was.
No, that makes sense, right? Because like my initial kind of like read on the situation is like there's a level of kind of like we have to execute perfectly in order to do this thing, right? But also that also can be kind of suffocating, right? Like you're just kind of like running a pattern, right? But I feel like that's kind of the game with MMOs. And so it makes sense to me that like essentially that's always been the thing, but only the people who care, like what it sounds like is the only people who did this before were the kind of people who liked that kind of challenge, right?
Yeah.
Because there was no material benefit, or it was just kind of like cosmetics or bragging rights, right? And the other people who don't like it, this is I think this might just go back to kind of like what players feel obligated to do, right? There's people who like feel like they're obligated to do this because this is how they get the good gear, and they're not happy about it the same way they weren't happy about grinding Korthia, right? Even though like they don't have to if they don't want to, right? Like they just kind of like want the thing easier, maybe, I guess.
Yeah, it's also I think there's also interesting questions about like friction, right? So for instance, one of the complaints that gets lobbied around a lot is the idea that the affixes, the Mythic Plus affixes, like bursting, explosive, grievous, whatever, right? Like all these different affixes, these are outdated, right? And a lot of people suggest that they should be reworked into something that is not harmful but is in fact beneficial, right? Because one of the things that Shadowlands did is had a lot of what are called kiss curse affixes, which is you have to do a thing that's hard, but when you do it, you get rewarded in some way, right? The design has pulled away from that a certain extent in Dragonflight. There is less especially in this, like this is typically the seasonal affixes, right? There is less kiss and more sort of curse. And I would make the argument that I think friction is important, and you're not supposed, like, people will say, God, I fucking hate quaking, right? Quaking is the worst affix. I hate looking at a week and seeing quaking. It's like, well, yeah, it's the fucking point. It's supposed to make the dungeon harder. No one is supposed to go, yes, I like quaking, because then it wouldn't be doing doing its job. But I also think that there are sort of questions around what a good affix is and what it could sort of look like, and the way in which it encourages you to play, that is interesting. Honestly, the argument that I think I'm most receptive to is just that they're stale, because we basically had the same affixes for 7 years in a lot of different places, and maybe we could do a thing. Like, I think one of the things that affixes did was they pulled from Greater Rifts, right? Like Mythic Plus pulled pretty hard from Greater Rifts in Diablo 3, right? But in Diablo 3 there were just way more affixes to sort of choose from. And I sort of wonder, in a world where like the full season of affixes are just going to be completely changed up, right? You're gonna have some affixes that are gonna be doing just wildly different things, depending on how like how this mechanic plays out at any individual time. And I just I don't know how I feel about that. I just feel like it is a complicated issue to sort of get to the other side of. But I obviously like Mythic Plus a lot, and It is interesting seeing it kind of like impact some of these things that I think of as a little bit rote have impacted the player base in a little bit of a different way.
Yeah, so this is interesting because I feel like the matchup's got to be between a rock and a hard place here, right? Because like the reason you don't do something like like a Greater Rift, which is like the Greater Rift just like does whatever fucking affix it wants, and if you get like a bad roll, then whatever, you fucking lose your Rift. Who cares, right? The problem is like you could theoretically do that per like keystone, I guess, in Mythic Plus, and like just have like a bigger variety. But part of the issue there is that like, well, if you continually get like unlucky, then you're going to miss out on like, or let's say you're towards the end of the season, right, and you're pushing for Keystone Master. You get fucked on your keystone, right? Like, well, then you're fucked out of the achievement for the whole season, right? Which is like not a concern you have with Diablo 3, right? Which is probably the issue here, right? It's like they need a certain amount of controllability, right? That way they can guarantee that players have a fair shot of like achieving their seasonal things. But that also is going to lead to staleness, right? Like,
yeah, and I also think there's a ton of upside to. Okay, so one of the things that we had to deal with this week was quaking. It was quaking raging, right? And there's a lot of upside to having set affixes inside of a week because it gives each week a kind of build climax behavior. When I'm doing keys early in the week, I'm sort of getting a feel for how the affix is going to interact with certain mechanics, what its timing is going to be like, what are the mobs that are going to get raging that we really have to be worried about, right? Like these kinds of things. And it means that, we did a bunch of Halls of Valor this week just because we ended up rolling into that key a whole lot. And when we did that, it was really impactful to go, holy shit. Actually, we need to worry about raging on this mob specifically because it's going to kill the tank, right? Or when this mob rages, we have to de-enrage it immediately because he's going to start spamming one-shot lightning bolts that are just going to kill people, right? And having that little progression inside of a week of I'm introduced to the affixes, I get better at the affixes, I finish the week, and I get new affixes. I actually think it's pretty good. I think there's a lot of upside there. But I definitely do think that, dealing with some of the same affixes that we've been dealing with for a long time has allowed sort of a crystallization of resentment towards them to sort of build up. And some affixes have kind of been put in the vault. They've been sort of shut away where it's just like, we're not dealing with necrotic. We're not dealing with, there's one called overflowing, which was really rough. Overflowing was an affix that says when you overheal a target, they actually get a heal absorb shield equal to the overhealing. So you had to be really precise with your heals and not overheal people. Everybody hated that affix.
yeah, no, I can see why, because like it also like puts the responsibility all on like basically one person, right? Like to handle the mechanic.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
so,
actually, to be fair, I think that that's okay. I think one of the things I think about when it comes to affixes is like, what is this testing, right? What skill is this testing? And I think that there are good and bad answers to that question, right? So for instance, the affix necrotic said every time something auto attacks you, it puts a heal debuff that says you take 2% less healing, right? And it stacks up pretty quickly in a mob with 6 guys who are all auto attacking you pretty frequently, right? And the way to do this was you would get your necrotic stacks up and then you would start kiting. And my thing with necrotic was it is fair to test a tank's ability to kite. Some tanks are going to have to kite at some times, and having an affix that goes learn to kite, right? I think is actually pretty interesting and pretty compelling, and a good way to sort of like build an affix. Whereas, I don't know, I'm trying to think of what do I think is a bad affix right now. I don't know, there was one affix called teaming, which just increased the amount of mobs in the dungeon. And it's just like, what am I learning there besides just the pulls are bigger, right? There are just more guys. You just need to AoE them harder. And they eventually pulled teaming out of the rotation, and I think that was a good decision. Or actually, a better one was skittish. Skittish was an affix that said tanks generate less threat, right? So your party needs to control their damage output in order to make sure that a tank is not getting you're not out threat you're not like
pulling mobs off the tank.
Pulling mobs off the tank, right? If you just unload with your burst AoE kind of cooldowns, and eventually we kind of got to a point where it's like, you know what, that's not a skill that we really want to do that much test. Aggro management has never been fun in WoW. We don't want to sit there and like gatekeep a bunch of DPS in order to kind of do that. And I think that there are some things that could be tested that aren't. For instance, I really like the idea of an affix that makes mobs powerful, like captain, captain is a weird word to use it, but just like you can imagine there are certain mobs in the group that make the whole group do more damage, and you want to burn out that mob as quickly as you can. That's not something like burst single target damage is not something that's tested in an affix right now, and I think you could design around that kind of a thing, right? And I'm sure that, you know, if I were a WoW designer, I could sit down and we could make a million different things of that, right? Which is, you know, maybe when a mob dies, it shoots an orb into the air and someone has to soak the orb or it does a bunch of damage to everyone, right? And so that's a thing of, okay, well, when that orb shoots, someone calls and coordinates to go soak it, right? Or like, I'm trying to think, what are some other examples of things that I would want to test if I was like a WoW developer? Maybe a fixate would be. Oh no, we already kind of have that with Spiteful, right? Which spawns these ghosts that kind of like chase you down. But whatever the case may be, there's a bunch of these, right? That you could sort of design, and we could sort of say, okay, yeah, I think it's fair to test the DPS's ability to do this, the tank's ability to do that. You know, these kinds of things. Anyway, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I don't do a ton of mythics, so I don't have a huge insight into it, but that makes I get that. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. What else can we talk about?
Have you with the stuff that you've been watching on YouTube? Is any of that like interesting, newsworthy?
I don't know. Let me go into my history. Not really. Bunch of like home improvement type videos. Videos.
So here's a question. Do you watch any Let's Plays, like D&D Let's Plays?
Tabletops, no. I have not watched tabletop Let's Plays in a long time. Have you?
No, but I am interested. I've been watching a lot of Dropout TV, which hosts Dimension 20.
Right. Yeah, no, I haven't watched it from Dropout. That's the thing that I forgot to talk about.
Yeah. Because I've been watching Game Changer. Like Rachel is really into Game Changer, so we're like watching Game Changer and certain of these other episodes. I really like Grant Anthony O'Brien. I think he's very funny. Brandon Lee Mulligan, I think, is everyone's favorite.
Yeah.
Including mine. I feel like that's a really basic bitch opinion. You know what I mean? It's like saying Iron Man is your favorite Avenger. It's like, okay, well, come on, like,
yeah.
You know.
Yeah. The Survivor episode was kind of wild.
What is the Survivor episode?
For Game Changer, the end of season 4, I want to say, is a 2-parter that's Survivor. With Brendan Lee Mulligan is one of the contestants, and he like is almost out the first round, and then he like pulls like he finds like an immunity charm, and he just like pulls it out of his ass like at the moment that it's happening.
Oh my God. I think the reason I like him so much is I feel like people will always say this, I'm sure. He mirrors a lot of like my energy. There's moments where I am frustrated like on his behalf. For instance, have you seen the episode Yes or No?
Yes, yeah. The one where the answer is he's just always wrong. Yeah.
Brennan must always lose or whatever. I was like, the feeling of just like vicarious unfairness was like infecting me. I was just like, this is bullshit, man. You know, like it's not me, obviously, but just like maybe it's like the game design person in my head that sees the rules being that shitty. Do you know what I mean? That are that's like interesting. Maybe a better example of this is the heart rate episode. Did you see that one?
No, I haven't yet. No.
Okay, the heart rate episode is hilarious. But it's Brendan Lee Mulligan and two other people who I don't remember because I'm terrible. But basically the idea is that he is trying to get them to spike their heart rate above 20 BPM above what it's supposed to be, right? So for instance, there's this one part where he just starts, Sam, the host, just starts telling like a whole story, and then eventually he just does like a jump scare, like "Brah!" And then he reads everyone's heart rate on the screen, and you can see who got like jump scared, basically, right? But the thing the thing that he did with Brennan that was pretty funny is he was like, "Okay, time for the mini game. It's called Name That Bird," right? And he puts up a picture of a bird. First one is like a chicken. First person says, "Oh, that's a chicken." Then he puts up another picture of a bird. It's a flamingo. The person goes, "That's a flamingo," and he goes, "That's right." And he puts up a picture of a bird, and it's like, who the fuck has ever seen a bird like this before in their fucking lives? And Brendan Lee Mulligan is like, it's like Amaterasu, and he's like, "Ooh, the answer is roseate spoonbill." Roseates, and it's like, and it's specifically targeted towards giving the other two really easy birds and giving Brendan really awful hard birds. And he does, in fact, I'm pretty sure he fails that challenge just because he's so angry at getting this like super, super unfair, set of questions. Anyway, I don't know, that stuff is interesting and funny. It's funny because there are moments in Game Changer where I think it's legitimately clever, and there are moments where I think it's kind of stupid and dumb, but in a really funny way. Like in the way that like someone farting is funny. The Game Changer episodes are funny. And I wonder like what underlies, some of
Yeah,
that.
I mean, some of it's just like good. Like the cast. Have you seen? I think it's called Cast Rehearsal, the one where they like basically make a musical up on the spot. Like it's
Welcome
every
to Mountport?
yeah. Welcome to Mountport.
Yeah,
It's so
yeah, yeah. I have
it's
watched
like
that
so
one like 4 times.
it's like so fucking incredible, right? Like that they managed to pull it off.
Yeah.
Like it is so good, right? Like that's like the karaoke episode is another one that's kind of in that same vein. It's not quite as good because like music the frame of a musical I think makes a little bit more sense because like you're kind of like singing it and like the sense doesn't always have to fit together quite right. It just kind of has to
Yep.
like hit like the musical beats. Versus the karaoke one works pretty well, but like you can tell that like some of it just like wants to be like a musical track instead. But like it's
Yeah,
incredible.
it's also funny. The musical episode people spun off and they made their own podcast about improvising musicals. And it's interesting because you can actually tell when you've listened to a few of those how some of the things they're doing are actually not as improvised as you might think because they are it's like the words in the song might be different, but like the melodies and like the musical phrases that they're using are actually kind of standardized in a way. Like they're falling into some of these, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, part of that is that like the musician on stage is the one that's like really kind of like is like he's doing kind of not necessarily the rote thing, but he's kind of doing the the like the thing that like is familiar enough, and they just kind of have to fit words to it, right? Which I think is
Yep.
the important part. Yeah, yeah, but yes, no, it's I kind of agree with you. There's one episode of Game Changer that I couldn't finish just because it made me so mad. I think I've talked about this before, which was the
Wait,
one
what
where
was it?
is like basically bet points on if this thing is real or not, or if this
Oh
thing is
yes, yeah.
yeah. It's just like the flaws in that as a game were just like so infuriating me. It's like I can't watch this anymore. But like that's just me being weird. Oh, something that I watched that I thought was interesting. This guy, the channel's called Ahoy, and they do different videos, but one that they've got the series where essentially one of the guys, I think his name is Stuart Brown, goes over the history of a firearm and its depiction in video games. And he just did a Barrett 50 cal episode, which I thought was super interesting because I consume not a ton but a fair amount of gun content on YouTube just because I find it fascinating. Guns are like weirdly simple machines, and there's a lot of history to them, right? Like every country in the world has developed firearms. They've got like a long and storied history, and like there's like in the United States in particular, there are like a number of like prominent gun makers, Eugene Stoner and his first name, John Browning, maybe Samuel Colt, right? Like, and there's a bunch of history there, and like you can there's stories to be told about all of that, um, but also kind of like the cultural impact. There's also like one of the guys, his name's John Ferguson. He's a guy at the Britain's Royal Armory, and they'll like basically you if you spend enough time on YouTube, you'll see these. Basically, UK GameSpot is like professional, gun historian reacts to guns, right? Like in video games, right? And like it's like him talking.
Oh yeah, all of those videos, I am hook, line, and sinker. I have gone down so many dumb rabbit holes about those. Yeah, I get you for sure.
Yeah, or like it's funny because like they'll show him like a Destiny video and be like, that doesn't make any sense. I see what they're going for, but like this gun, obviously it's a fantasy gun, right? But like
yeah, the one that I ended up going down was tank, like the history of tanks, and there are these tank experts, and they have these like top 10 Swedish tanks post World War II. It's like, who the fuck? So like, who cares? I don't know. I do. I've watched a lot of those videos. Okay. It's also like Titanic videos. Oh my God. My feed is covered in these. Because I just went down this rabbit hole of like shipwrecks and ship sinkings and like the stories of different ships as they sank.
Is this related to the Northwest Passage stuff that we talked about at one point?
It's not related, but it is like part of it. I think that there is just something. So, do you know what thalassophobia is?
It's the fear of like the deep water, right?
Yeah, it's like the fear of like the endless ocean, right? Like, so one of the best cases of sort of like real thalassophobia is there was an American couple that was in vacation in Australia, and they went on a like a scuba diving trip, and the scuba diving instructor did a count off, and he counted 20 people on the boat or whatever. They drove out there, and everybody was snorkeling around, scuba diving around this like reef or whatever, a couple miles offshore, probably like the Great Barrier Reef, that kind of a thing. Then everybody got back on the boat, and the diver instructor miscounts the people on the boat. He counts 2 people twice. And he thinks he has everybody on the boat, and they drive back inland. And they leave 2 people out there in the reef, who presumably died. Technically they would be missing, but like obviously they're fucking dead, right? There's a movie about this that I can't remember the name of. But it is like the horror story, but it's just, you're out there, you're in the open ocean, there's nothing around you for miles and miles, and there is hundreds of feet of water like below you, and there's just like something so inherently terrifying about that, that I can't help but fixate on it. And so I'll watch these like Titanic videos, or just like other stuff, right? Like a big one is like World War II ships sinking. It's like, what is it, like what does it look like when 460 people on a cruiser, that gets torpedoed by a Japanese submarine that sinks off the coast of Papua New Guinea, right? Stuff like that. I just like, I can't help myself. But it fills my YouTube, like the algorithm fills my YouTube recommendations with like all of this, like all of this shit, which I think is pretty funny. Honestly, the YouTube video that I've been thinking about most recently has been this Big Bear bald eagle cam. Do you know about the snowstorm that's hitting Southern California right now?
No.
Yeah, there's like this freak fucking snowstorm that has hit California. Like the mountains around Los Angeles have snow caps, which is an incredibly weird thing. But in that line of sort of mountains, in this like sort of ridge of mountains, the biggest one of this is called Big Bear. And there's a YouTube live stream of a camera that somebody put at an eagle's nest, and because obviously the snowstorm is like dumping all of this snow on top of these eagles, there's kind of this inherent drama of these 2 eagles. They have these 2 eggs, they have eggs, and they're switching off to make sure like the eggs are incubated. And it's just like, oh my God, the drama is so good. I just can't. Every couple of, the first thing I do when I get up is I check in on the eagles to make sure that they're okay. If you were to like put it on right now, you'd be like seeing. I think he's sleeping, to be honest. But he's like completely covered in snow, right? The whole nest is covered in snow, and the wind is absolutely insane. Anyway, so that's the other YouTube video that I've been obsessed with is the Big Bear Bald Eagle cam.
Something YouTube dropped into my recommendations was a guy who like a hobbyist who like disassembles, cleans, and puts back together watches, and it's like I am so fucking here for this. Like
Oh
this,
my god!
it's called
Wow.
it's called Wristwatch Revival. If anybody else is curious, but it's like this is like I have at one point like a couple of years ago I like bought like a basic set of like watch making gear, like watch tuning gear. And I like diddled around with it a little bit, but like I like didn't get super far in it. But like this is like this gives this is it. This is exactly what I want, and maybe I'll go back and actually like take apart like some of those watches at some point. Like, oh, this is great.
Oh
Um,
my god! I should show this to my dad. My grandfather, or my great grandfather, my grandfather's father, was
a
a
watchmaker.
watchmaker. Yeah, and it was a big thing in our family because we have his old tools, which are you would never use them for anything else, and it's this gigantic cabinet of them, and it's really heavy. But my dad has carted it around for 40 years basically, from house to house to his apartment in Newark, and it is just like these antique tools from the 1900s, or I guess the early 20th century, that my grandfather used to repair watches and clocks. So yeah.
Very cool. The other one just to mention is once a month. Say Jam. Say Jam's a guy who does. He's like a FGC commentator. Um, he does a thing called Will It Kill, which is people send in a bunch of clips of like combos, and the rules are basically like he shows the start of the combo, he pauses it, and he says Will it kill, and he does this live on Twitch, but I watch the replays on YouTube, and it's like you bet on whether or not you bet channel points on whether or not you think the combo will kill or not. And it's always good fucking fun to watch. It's been like because like the first half is like games that I know and like I can make some educated guesses about. The second half is all like these ludicrous games that are like, are you familiar with the concept of like a one touch game or a two touch game?
I guess not.
So fighting games can like one way to classify fighting games is the number of touches that you need in order to win the game, right? Like a perfectly executed combo, right? Like so like something like Marvel vs. Capcom 3 is a very low touch game, right? Like you get hit once and you're potentially dead just if the combo is super well executed. Um uh versus like something like Street Fighter is like a 5 or 6 touch game typically, where like a well executed combo like you can get hit a couple of times before you're at risk of dying from getting hit. Um, some of these like second half games are like there's a couple that have become mainstays like this game called Kianta, which featured heavily in the last one, which is like a game where like basically one hit and like if you combo it right you're fucked. And it's also like a goofy looking game, which is part of it. But like so it's like stuff you've never heard of, right? Like it's like I think once, and it might have like in the middle section they have like clips that are too stupid to use essentially. Um, but there was one that was like the Jimmy Neutron fighting game, and they just like just like Sheen like just fucking like silent on somebody and like they die instantly, right? Like
Yeah,
um
sure.
because like it's kind of like speedrunning where like somebody will be obsessive about a game that you've never heard of and never cared about, but there's like a community for it type of deal. So yeah, um, that's been most of my stuff. But unless you got anything else you want to talk about, we are over time, and so we can close
I
it
have
out.
nothing else I'm looking to talk about. We can cut it.
All right. Well, in that case, I will say, you can reach it if you want to email us about any of the stuff that you saw on this podcast, or anything else. You can reach us at subversiveplaygames@gmail.com or podcast at subversiveplaygames.com. You can follow us on twitch.tv/subversiveplaygames or youtube.com/@subversiveplaygames where these go out live. That's everything I have. But do you have anything you're looking to promote?
I have nothing else that I'm looking to promote.
In that case, I'm going to say until next time, dear listeners.
Until next time, loyal listeners.